Hi, good morning. Thank you for joining us today for Stories to Watch 2019. I'm Michael Oko. I'm the Global Communication Director here at WRI. Welcome. We're very glad you're joining us here in the room and to those online watching on the live stream. Those who are less familiar with WRI, we are a global research organization. We look at the intersection of the environment, economy, and human well-being. We're a global organization. We have around 8 offices around the world. We're really proud of our staff. Over 50% of our staff is now overseas. The rest of us are here in Washington and throughout the U.S. Stories to Watch is a presentation that we give every year. This is actually our 16th year giving the Stories to Watch. So hopefully we've learned something. Hopefully we'll be pretty good at this. We're not predicting the future. What we are doing is we're looking at trends, data, developments in our space. We actually collect input from across our organization. A lot of our experts here, in particular up in these couple of rows on my right, provide a lot of input. We have a research team, works very hard to develop these stories. But we're not predicting the future. We've learned predictions can be unpredictable, so we're not going to do that. But we'll look at trends and developments. I, for one, was glad that, like last night, Donald Trump didn't make too much news, which would have made us have to perhaps redo our entire deck. So I was very glad that he kept a pretty low key last night. Couple housekeeping notes. One, please use the hashtag STW19. Please do share the presentation, tweet, do all that. Maybe not so much during the presentation, but as you see things that you find interesting, give us feedback, let us know how we did. We will have a Q&A session after the presentation. You'll see note cards on your chairs. You can fill out questions as they come. We'll have people collecting note cards, and we'll also call on people after the presentation, but we do look to engage with all of you and help sharpen our stories as we go forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce WRI's President and CEO, Andrew Steer. He doesn't need much of an introduction because he's very well known to all of you, but he's our president. He is a very well-known economist. He travels around the world meeting with experts and leaders in government, business, civil society. He's highly sought after by the media. He writes a lot, and he is going to share the stories to watch for 2019. So welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Great. Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I hope we'll have a good discussion. You probably have your own stories for 2019, and please feel free to say where you think we've gone wrong. This is a great exercise we do each year. It's really enjoyable. We start in December, and we sort of make this a really consultative process around our global network. And you can imagine there's some quite strong feelings. And then what we do is we ask some of our brightest, youngest researchers to lead individual stories. And they then work with the technical people. And I'd like just them to, at the moment, put their hands up or stand up. Those that are here, maybe they all stayed up all night. Could you please? These are the guys that actually did the work. So thank you very much indeed. Now, there's no science to this. But there is a lot of judgment and a lot of wisdom in this. So we hope you find it useful. And you're probably thinking now, why didn't they do subject X? Why did you not pick oceans this year? And the reason is we actually picked oceans last year. And we don't want to have the same issues every year. So bear with us on that. Let's just start with a sort of, it's quite a year, quite frankly, that we're going into. What a time we live in. Good news? Another 25 million people lifted out of poverty in the last 12 months. We've never in the history of the world seen the progress that we've seen in the last 20 years. Incredibly good news. But we're getting more and more unequal. Just think of the fact the 42 richest people in the world have the same wealth as the combined wealth of the poorest half of the world's population. Now, how many of these 42 do you know? Because we would like to meet them. Look, massive volatility all over the place, and you know this. Those of you who have money in the stock market, worst December since the Great Depression, and not just in the US stock market, of course. Other things changing, a year of discontent and populism, not just in France, but actually a much, much bigger issue around the world. Old coalitions are breaking down. It's not just Mrs. May leaving Europe, and we hope she doesn't, by the way. We're still, those of us that come from that part of the world, we're still hoping there's a way that we might stay in. But we tend just not to like each other as much these days. You know, the old rules just don't seem to apply, and a general sort of breaking down of multilateralism. I mean, look at this. I mean, suddenly, just the day before yesterday, our good friend Jim Kim, who's done an amazing job, suddenly decides he's leaving. And the World Bank president, every single president since 1944 has been nominated by the US president. So just imagine the battle that's going to happen in this incredibly important multilateral institution. And interestingly, yesterday, the World Bank launched its economic report, and its title was Darkening Skies. So do read it. And skies are darkening. So the question is, it's a precarious year, that's pretty obvious. What are the questions? I'm going to suggest 7 stories to watch. Now, the first one is the longest, so don't feel, you know, they're all going to be that long. They get shorter and livelier as we go along. So question number 1, in these tumultuous times, will geopolitics stymie climate action? Look, we thought for a brief period that world emissions of greenhouse gases were leveling off. Sadly, not. They are still increasing. In the United States, where we are now, which absolutely should be lowering greenhouse gases every single year, the estimate just came out yesterday from the Rhodian Group is that emissions grew last year by 3.4%, the biggest since 2010. You don't need to know this. A lot more extreme events than ever before in recorded history. The problem is crystal clear. You've all read the 1.5-degree report from the IPCC. Makes 2 points. 1, the problem is massively more difficult than we thought. And 2, in order to solve it, we will need radical disruptive change across all of the economic systems that we have in the world. The good news is it's perfectly possible. We here in WRI and the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate has demonstrated with some of the best economists in the world that actually moving from today's high carbon, low efficiency world economy to tomorrow's high efficiency, low carbon world economy actually doesn't require a huge dip in employment and growth. Actually, you can keep on growing, you can do better. Our most recent report, and Helen Mountford, our director, is over there, $26 trillion of extra income and output if we do smartly adopt the right policies for climate change. The problem is vast. It's doable. And actually in Poland, we saw in the 23rd hour more progress than we thought. There is a rule book now. It's not so bad, actually. It's pretty good. There was a little more encouragement on ambition than we thought, a little more encouragement on finance than some people thought. And Greta, this young woman here of 15, you know, gave a sort of clarion call in terms of the next generation. So not all bad, but quite frankly, some pretty big questions around the world this year. Brazil has moved pretty radically to the right. What will that imply? Mexico's moved pretty radically to the left. What will that imply for our agenda? Germany is not able to play the role it has traditionally played as a leader in this space. Elections in Indonesia, and Indonesia's been doing some really great things recently. Don't know what they will imply. Elections in India coming along in just a few months. We don't know how that will turn out, or whether when Mr. Modi maybe gets re-elected, what line will he take? Could he really, in a second administration, really embrace, like he started to do, on renewable energy? Canada, pretty exciting stuff, but political headwinds make it extremely difficult to see through this very ambitious plan. And of course, China, slowing down, very understandable. But generally, when you slow down, it's a little bit harder to be the same leader that you wanted to be on issues like this. Amazing progress in reducing air pollution in the last 2 years in China, but quite a high price they've paid in terms of closing factories. That's easier to do when you're growing well. harder to do when you're slowing down. So that's the context, if you like. So how will all of this shifting political dynamics, how will it affect collective action? Obviously, we should look in September at the Leaders Summit. You know, we'll have well over 100 heads of state in New York coming to discuss climate change. And by the way, just the day before or the day after, they will be discussing the Sustainable Development Goals. And the question is, will they be able to understand that if you want to address the Sustainable Development Goals, which they all do, you better address climate. And if you want to address climate, by the way, you'd better address the Sustainable Development Goals. Just 3 years ago, when in 2015 we had the Sustainable Development Goals and we had the Paris deal, everyone was saying, isn't it complicated? You know, I mean, is it the Paris deal we should worry about or the SDGs? It's now not complicated at all. It's now crystal clear that if you want to address climate change, address the SDGs, because almost every one of them is consistent. So the question is, will they be able to make that point? And will the corporate sector, who will be there plentifully, be able to engage with the political sector? Another thing to watch this year on the multilateral agenda is the Green Climate Fund. You remember it was filled with $10.3 billion originally. The US has now dropped out, making that a smaller amount of money than it was. This year they have the first replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. How will that turn out? Quite frankly, at the moment, because the governance structure of the Green Climate Fund has been pretty dysfunctional, a lot of donors are saying, my goodness me, why would we want to put money in there? So this coming few months is going to be extremely important, both in terms of who's lining up in terms of put resources in. And by the way, Germany and Norway have both agreed already they will double their contribution, so that's encouraging. But not only who is going to put money in, but what are the kinds of reforms that will be required in order to justify that money. This is an extremely important issue for the coming year. And then here's the final thing we should really be thinking about. There are always two worlds in the line of business of climate change. There's the world of negotiations, which tends to be slow and frustrating and through the night negotiating, you know, commas. And then there's the real world of action. And the real world of action is incredibly energetic right now. I mean, just one, Maersk, for example, picked this one because they have said, we're going to go to net zero. This is the biggest shipping line in the world, net zero by 2050. And the brilliant thing about this is they don't know how they're going to do it. And just as John Kennedy didn't know how he was going to get to the moon. This is the kind of commitment we want, because they will be able to do it as long as they stick true. There are now over 500 multinational companies that are committed to what are called science-based targets. That means we are committed to decarbonize throughout our entire supply chain over the next 40 years, and we're going to have markers every single year along the road. We're going to be totally transparent, and we're going to invite organizations like World Resources Institute, World Wildlife Fund, CDP, when we manage this together with the Global Compact, to come in and sort of advise us and check on us. Why are they doing it? They're doing it not because anyone's telling them to. They're doing it because they think it's good for their long-term prospects. These guys can influence politicians. And the question will be, are we going to see the action agenda trump the politicians? So that's story number one. And as I say, the rest will be a little bit shorter. The second story is equally important. Adaptation has been the poor sister of mitigation. And it's not like adaptation's new. Since 2001, the UNFCCC has been talking about it, but quite frankly, not doing enough about it. Everybody knows that climate impacts are here today. They're not tomorrow. This is a great picture, by the way. You won't be able to see it, but there are 6 individual tropical cyclones on one day in 2018. And the estimate, you know, there are people that estimate the energy level in hurricanes and typhoons. 2018, both for the Atlantic season and the Pacific season, were the highest on record. Hotter days, everybody knows that, but not everybody knows the scale of the impact. I think everyone here knows about fiercer fires. The biggest disaster this year was the fire in California, longer droughts with tragic consequences, higher seas that will affect 150 million extra people by 2050. And the IPCC report made the point that not only are these things happening now, and remember it's 1 degree we've risen so far, even if we get to 1.5, which would be regarded as a great triumph, 1.5, you still see some pretty bad things happening. But if you go up to 2 degrees, which is what we've always thought, you'll actually be losing 99% of the coral reefs in the world. I mean, what an incredible tragedy. And this would be regarded as a success under UNFCCC. And so just look at them. There are 20 such measures. If you go on our website, you'll see all of this in much more detail. And obviously, it is the poorest that are almost always hurt the most. The poor cannot protect themselves. This is a deeply moral issue that we need to face up to. So there are certainly bright spots, around the world. I mean, this happens to be in Rwanda, where some very, very innovative sort of work on agriculture and making things more resilient. So there's plenty of good things. Colombia has got an incredibly lively and integrated approach. Bangladesh is doing a great job. A number of developed countries. This is the Netherlands, which is a real leader in this space. They've been protecting themselves for years. 1/3 of the whole of the Netherlands is actually below sea level. So they're awfully good at this. So it's not like nothing's happening. But the problem is it simply isn't adding up. There's no global leadership. There hasn't been leadership until now in this area. There's no sort of political narrative on adaptation that's really attractive and links it to the economy. It's perceived to be very complicated. It's perceived that we need sort of multi-sectoral, multi-ministerial. We don't really have good metrics as to what defines resilient developments. Benefits tend to be sort of long-term, and politicians think short-term. There's nothing really, no ribbons to cut, as there would be, for example, on a solar farm or something like that. And so finance hasn't been very responsive. So basically, despite lots of bright points, we've dropped the ball on adaptation. So why is it important right now? Well, just in the last few months, a major international commission on adaptation has been set up, and 3 leaders, Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, Kristalina Georgieva, are leading it. The Dutch government played a very big role in setting it up, but they asked us and the new Center for Adaptation in Rotterdam to manage the process, which we're doing. Christina over there, Chen, is the co-director of the exercise. Sponsoring this commission. So we're actually potentially seeing a level of leadership that we've never seen before, which is very encouraging. The UK, Mrs. May, Prime Minister, has offered to lead the resilience track at the climate summit in September. So what is this going to deliver? It's going to deliver 3 things: a flagship report that we're working very hard on right now, which will be delivered to the Secretary General at the climate summit, some action tracks, maybe 5 or 6 sort of major new initiatives that will be seized by these politicians and advanced, and then a year of action. So following the climate summit, we then have what's called a year of action, but of course it'll be many, many years of action. But just a few points. I mean, first, making the case. So what to watch is, will we start seeing more politicians with a coherent story linking adaptation to their overall development endeavor? Will we start seeing that before and during the climate summit? Will the case be made economically and developmentally for adaptation? Will we start seeing progress on financial barriers? It's wonderful. Actually, the World Bank has just announced another $200 billion for climate change, of which half, $100 billion, would go to adaptation. We'll need an annual amount of $300 billion at least by 2030. It's been a huge amount of discussion about how do we get the private sector involved. And so this is a major thrust of the Commission, as you can imagine. Will we start seeing some movement there, not just from the insurance companies, which are already very interested, but more broadly from the financial sector? Second issue, rural resilience, food security, and agriculture, absolutely central. One of the reasons Bill Gates agreed to be co-chair of this commission is because he wants the Gates Foundation and himself, he believes that resilience in agriculture and food is so important that they're really sort of taking a major lead together with others in this part of the commission's work. And then finally, the urban story. Very important, every 3 years, the C40 mayors, 96 of the largest cities in the world, gather. This is going to be a major theme for them when they gather in October. And it's not just those 96, it's going to be many, many others as well. Will the whole subject of adaptation and urban resilience become a central part of what they do? So that's story number 2. Will climate adaptation rise on the agenda? Okay, so it's all getting pretty heavy at the moment, isn't it? So story number 3 is a story that, I've got to admit that I am not particularly well qualified to address. As my 17-year-old daughter told me last night when I was taking her through this, will fast fashion slow down? The fashion industry, the clothes industry is massive, and it's growing. The average consumer today spends 60% more on clothes than they did just in 2000. Now, this is something that some of you will understand, and I must admit I didn't. In the old days, you had different fashions for maybe spring and summer, autumn, and maybe winter, maybe 4. Some of us just have one fashion season. But now, you won't believe this, they now have 50 micro seasons. This is honestly true. And I was asking my daughter last night what this might mean, and she found it totally intuitive. And so did my son, who's 16, because this is not a female thing, by the way. This is male and female. So clothes are coming into fashion and going out of fashion much more quickly. She showed me honestly, her closet last night. She said, a year ago, this was so trendy, she said, I wouldn't be seen dead in it now. No wonder then things are, and that's what we mean by will fast fashion slow down a little, because the trail of waste is vast. Think of a garbage truck every single second being destroyed. Think of this. These are microfibers going into the ocean, equivalent to 50 billion plastic bottles a year. This is very serious stuff. Think about the use of water. Think about all the water that you will need to drink in the next 2.5 years. That's a lot. That amount is needed to produce one shirt, one cotton shirt. And as my son told me last night, last year there were 60 billion T-shirts sold in the world. 60, that's amazing. That's like 9 for every person. And I didn't buy 9, so someone else must have had even more. I don't think Tom did either, did you? You're not really a T-shirt kind of guy, Tom, are you? So also, look, I think you're all aware, a lot of bad practices in this. Lots of reports come out on this. So this is an industry that actually needs some reform, and some very exciting things are starting to happen. This story is a sub-story, if you like, of the circular economy story. And most people don't think of fashion being part of the circular economy because they can't think about, what do we do with this shirt? How can you recycle it? Well, yeah, you can actually. There's some repair, rent, resale, and recycle. You're now getting, stores in New York where you take your Levi's in to get them repaired, believe it or not. Rent the Runway, this is a huge success where you actually rent very fancy clothes. The Real is a very high-end consignment store, by the way. And we're starting to see sort of even some new, pretty interesting technologies for creating textiles. from banana leaves. Honestly. So the question in all of this is, as you can see where this story is going, is this going to be a fad, or could it be something much more serious? So will the fashion industry follow through? Now, at Katowice in Poland, they launched the Fashion Industry Charter, and 43 major fashion companies signed up to that. H&M, for example, has committed to go to 100% circular, which is quite something for a company as vast as that. And so too, in March this year, there will be a UN Alliance on Sustainable Fashion, which will set the rules, if you like, for those that choose to subscribe, and UN Environment is in the lead on that. There's also the issue of, well, how do we measure, and how transparent are we going to be? And so we're heavily involved in, as you know, science-based targets. So we're doing a lot of technical work as to what would be the guidance for apparel and footwear companies. And we will be launching that as part of the broader science-based targets guidance in May. And I mentioned already there's more than 500 global companies signed up to science-based targets. So far, we haven't had the guidance for this sector, so we expect a lot more to come in. The Sustainable Apparel Coalition is also working hard, launching a platform for reporting. So this year, actually, is an important year of decision to some extent. Lots of excitement in the last few months and year. Will we start seeing something really happening? Europe is in many ways in the lead on this. The European Union is looking to agree upon very tough new regulations, which all member countries will have to subscribe to. Developing countries, for them, it's actually a lot more complicated. East Africa has just issued a ban on importing used clothes for very understandable reasons. They want to support their own textile industry. But actually, this doesn't necessarily help the overall endeavor, even though it's very understandable. It will, in turn, put more pressure on those countries that are sending their old clothing to East Africa. So some pretty interesting stories. So watch this in 2019. Will it be a fringe or the next wave? So that's story number 3. All right. Now, back to something that is, well, that was serious, but back to something that you would expect and something that is serious. Decision time. All of us, I bet, in this room have rejoiced over the last few years as to how in supply chains we're starting to see a little bit of traction in terms of greening supply chains. And this story is about, well, how's it going and what could happen this year, one way or the other. Look at this, by the way. This is, see these, if you look very carefully, you see the red here. This is deforestation, whether it's yellow or red, these different things. These are the causes of deforestation over the last 15 years. And the red is commodities, internationally traded commodities. And you see for Latin America and for East Asia, this is palm oil. This, as you know, tends to be soy and beef and leather. And in Africa generally has been more shifting cultivation. This just goes to 2015. But increasingly, Africa is the home of palm oil and cocoa, for example. So this will start going red as well. That gives you a sort of flavor. These are the 4 big traded commodities causing most of the damage, but there are others as well, like cocoa and so on. And by the way, you know, we have to be very careful not to blame others. It's very easy to blame the system, but for example, everyone in this room has probably used palm oil 4 times this morning already. Certainly if you had a muffin, certainly if you used shampoo, certainly if you put any makeup on, certainly if you came to work using biofuels as a mixture in your petrol, for example. So we're all in this together, and that's why it's a supply chain where we need all the players. roughly half of all deforestation is caused by these big internationally traded commodities. The good news is that more than 500 major companies have signed up to commitments, not to support deforestation, but to actually monitor to make sure they're not causing the problem. And the Tropical Forest Alliance, Consumer Goods Forum, etc. Remember the New York Declaration of Forests? And more than half of all of the major commodity players have such commitments. Now, the problem is that these commitments tend not to be very consistent. We tend not to have very credible reporting, and a lot of actors are not involved. So whilst 3 or 4 years ago, we really felt, for example, we were making massive progress on palm oil in East Asia, actually it's turning out to be more difficult than we thought, and we're actually seeing a great tragedy here. I mean, this is astonishing. Do you remember just 3 years ago we were saying, isn't it great how Brazilian deforestation has declined and then Indonesian was rising? Do you remember back in 2010 of Bali and the COP? We thought this was a crisis, remember, and the whole emphasis on REDD+ and so on, where this was a crisis. Well, look at it now. This is deforestation in the last 2 years. Now, this doesn't include 2018, and one of the things to watch will be, I think around about sort of just after the middle of the year, we will get 2018 data. And let's hope and pray it's down here, but we don't actually know at the moment what it would be. But we are in a crisis situation, and it's also a human problem. More than 200 environmental defenders lost their lives by being murdered last year, defending the world's forests. So this is a great tragedy. So what to watch for? The EU again is considering some very serious legislation. What to watch? Will the new Brazilian president actually open up the Amazon and take away the rights of indigenous people? We don't know, but that needs to be watched. Will Indonesia, which has been progressing very well, last year in 2017, deforestation in Indonesia fell by 60%. So that was encouraging. Will that continue? And will companies double down? There's 2 points here. One is some very, very good companies. The one, you know, the Nestle's, the Unilevers, the good guys that are really trying to do their best. You know, they've set targets. They're working incredibly hard to deliver their targets. Quite frankly, it's just very difficult. It's very difficult to actually monitor and know exactly what's going on. We have World Global Forest Watch, which helps them a lot. But so we shouldn't blame them. They are trying very, very hard. It is difficult to do this. But then the second issue is there's a whole bunch of companies that maybe gave lip service to targets. And for them, you know, there's a lot of dropping the ball and so on. So the question is this year, will we start seeing a little more bite to the accountability? The Tropical Forest Alliance Assembly will be in Colombia in May. This will be an important opportunity. Next week in Davos, the week after next in Davos, this will be actually an important theme as well, where the Tropical Forest Alliance will be working. New technologies, watch these this year. A huge new product line from Global Forest Watch will make a difference called GFW Pro. It will enable much greater functionality for individual companies. They will be able to upload their confidential data as well and manipulate that and know exactly what's happening through their supply chains. So that's very good. Satellite monitoring, much more sophisticated now. Wilmar, which trades about 40% of all the palm oil in the world, is launching some very, very sophisticated approaches. There's also an accountability framework which will be launched in the middle of this year. A whole group of industry leaders and NGOs are basically trying to bring that bite back in. So watch this space. Finally, this year and next year, the issue of biodiversity is rising rapidly up the agenda. And the reason for that is we're reaching the end of the decade of biodiversity. Remember the Aichi targets, which are supposed to be delivered by 2020, and sadly, most of them won't be delivered. The next big COP for biodiversity, where they have to set the goals for the next 10 years, will be in Beijing, which is very important. Chinese government is committed to make that a success. What does that mean? Well, it means quite a lot because of China's engagement in the commodity business, as the largest importer, the world will be having some really interesting discussions with China. And China itself has recognized that it needs to really sort of ramp up its own concerns if it's going to do what it needs to do for biodiversity. And it seems to be very serious that it actually wants to do a good job. So the question is, can biodiversity to some extent help forests? Tragically, 1,000 orangutans are being lost every year because of deforestation. So that's very sad indeed. So that's story number 4. Will commodity supply chains rise to the challenge? How are we doing? Okay? Right? Okay. If you want to interrupt, please do if you feel we're off track. So we're sort of heading into the home straight now. But this is a big, it's not a long story, but it's a big story. Still on the subject of China, Belt and Road, the project of the century. This is a crucial year for Belt and Road. What is the Belt and Road? Well, it's a belt, and that's a series of roads. So the belt is dry land. The road is actually water. That's the series of ports. But also it's other infrastructure as well, housing, oil and gas, pulp and paper. It's all even non-built infrastructure like telecoms. Now, I want to make a point here. You know, I will be saying a few things like, wow, we better be careful, and it's not exactly where it needs to be. But let's remind ourselves, this is infrastructure that's needed. This is infrastructure that actually will help grow the economy and reduce poverty. So I want to be clear that, you know, here at WRI, we think the Belt and Road can be very positive, but it's difficult to make it as positive as it needs to be. Now, if you try and find a map of Belt and Road, you will find dozens of them. And the reason for that is that still the definitions are a little bit confusing, and that's why this is confusing. I'm not going to explain it all to you, but there's just lots of different things. This is the so-called belt. This is the so-called road. But actually, you know, I mean, there are 65 countries narrowly in the Belt and Road, but actually there's over 100 that are eligible. They're Belt and Road projects in Latin America. So this is a big program. Just to illustrate, just 1 year, 2017. Chinese commitment to the Belt and Road was $113 billion. Just by comparison, commitments, and these are not exactly apples to apples, by the way, but roughly speaking, World Bank Group was $60 billion, and Asian Development Bank, where they cover a lot of the Belt and Road territory, was $20 billion. Gives you a sense of how important this is, and basically, China plans to put $1 trillion, 1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. But overall, this is expected to be a $10 trillion enterprise. So that's a pretty serious enterprise. And China is pushing for what it calls, as you know, ecological civilization. I have the privilege of sitting on something called the China Council. We meet every year with the ministers and the vice premier. My perception is that they're actually serious about wanting ecological civilization. And when President Xi Jinping says green is the new gold, it means he actually does get the fact that the economy will benefit if they reduce air pollution and they address climate change and become more resilient and so on. So they want to do this. And the real question is, can they do that for the Belt and Road, just as they're trying to do for their own country? The World Resource Institute has done some analysis at the moment on energy. It doesn't look where it needs to be, quite frankly. So these are the different sources of funds from China for the Belt and Road. There's the syndicated loans by the 6 Chinese banks. There are those that are exclusively financed by China Development Bank, Exim Bank. There's the Silk Road Fund. Then there are non-financial institutions, including some private Chinese institutions. So the black this is just investment in energy. And so the black is investment in fossil fuel, generation of electricity. Green is renewable. So you see, it's not where it needs to be, quite frankly. And there's an important point here, because what China would say with some legitimacy is, it's not for us to go and preach to countries what they do around the world. This is what's being requested by these countries. Whilst, for example, the World Bank would go in and say, you must have renewable energy, China would say, well, actually, no, these countries need to determine. So it's actually a little bit more complicated, but this story is not encouraging. I presented these data at the China Council, and the Chinese government was very interested in this because the Belt and Road actually doesn't have a real central control and coordination. It's quite actually disaggregated. And so one of the interesting things will be, is there more of a kind of centralized data point for Belt and Road? And by the way, it's not just energy, it's also biodiversity. The World Wildlife Fund has done some very interesting maps showing all of the high value critical areas, and 1,739 key biodiversity areas on the BRI route. So this is all part of it. So what to watch for? In April, the date's not set yet, but there will be a sort of a major Belt and Road forum, which will bring heads of state and ministers and key players from all the Belt and Road countries. It will be a huge thing. And the question is, will sustainability sort of really be clear there? Will it move more towards the kind of traditional multilateral development banks? See Ken Lay over there, who's been very much part of that. The World Bank, traditionally the World Bank or the Asian Bank, they have had guidelines that are pretty strict. They're really guidelines that are imposed upon the recipient country. Will it head in that direction, or will it head in another direction which enables real sustainability? Will China, which is obviously leading the world on renewable energy, China is investing more than twice as much in renewable energy as the whole of Europe is, or the whole of the United States is. So China's the world leader on renewable energy. Will it do the same for the countries that it's trying to help? We did some analysis looking at the NDCs of the Belt and Road recipient countries. And only 31 of those NDCs had serious estimates of what they need for renewable energy. But if you simply add those up, it's $470 billion just in those 31 countries. So the question would be, would China not be able to support countries implement their NDCs? And that, to some extent, is the big issue, we believe, is it possible to get into a kind of conversation between the providers of finance on the Belt and Road and the countries themselves that are recipients who have written already NDCs that say we want to move towards low carbon development. Now, the truth of the matter is most of these countries have people that are dealing with the Belt and Road that don't know anything about their NDCs. It's a different part of the government. So one of the pieces of sort of engagement that we and others are going to engage in as part of the NDC partnership is, wait a minute, can we start bringing that together? And as we move to 2020 and a whole new series of NDCs, which now under the rule book, there are very clear definitions of how you need to do your NDC, where there will be a lot more detail provided, we will be in a better state. So that's these are the kinds of issues to look for in the Belt and Road. So just two more stories now you'll be very thankful about. And story number 6 is another fun one, but it's actually quite important. Micro-mobility. Have you tripped up over scooters that are lying on the sidewalk? Is it the fad or is it the future? So it's basically East Asia and the United States that have put big money in, but actually Europe, this is investments. So you've got the Limes, which are owned by Uber. You've got I guess Motivate is owned by Lyft, and then you've got lots of Bird, which is I think the biggest is independent. You've got Ofu and so on. So this is bike sharing, e-motor scooters, and e-scooters. By the way, so you think, well, I mean, we couldn't use this to get to work. Well, actually, yes, you could. In the United States, 60% of all journeys are less than 6 miles. And in other countries, it's much less than that, much less. Most countries, especially Europe, but also developing countries, much less than the 6 miles. So actually, you could take a scooter to work if it was safe, if you had the right lanes and so on. Scooters, believe it or not, who here has been on an electric scooter, by the way? Well, that's impressive. A year from now, it'll be a lot more of you, by the way. Bird was the quickest company in stock market history to reach the so-called unicorn status, worth $1 billion. That's quite something, isn't it? So someone believes in this. But this is China. If anyone's been to China and Beijing, it's absolutely amazing. I mean, this is just trash. some of these bikes cost $10 to produce, so they just treat them like that. We're also starting to see very low quality in some areas. Things break down. The life of these is slow. Also, in some parts of some cities, these micro mobility instruments are basically pushing pedestrians off the sidewalk because they're taking so much space. And so the question really is, do you remember 20 years ago? Do you remember 20 years ago where some of the leading investors in this country said, Steve Jobs, he said, the single biggest technological advance that will change the lives of people as much as the personal computer did is the Segway. It's hard to believe, isn't it? And it went nowhere. And the reason was it's very expensive, nowhere to store it, etc. Now, the question is, will this micromobility become like that? Or, and we suspect it won't, because we're starting to see big companies now, whether it's Ford is investing in this, Uber and Lyft, I've already mentioned, General Motors is going to produce an electric bicycle. So some pretty interesting things here. Costs have come down, and psychology has changed in the last 20 years. But there are some big questions. What about, by the way, this is Moscow. I mean, you wouldn't, it's amazing. I mean, this is Moscow. So this is now a phenomenon all over. What about governments in every city around the world and at the central level are trying to figure out, how do we deal with this? This is so new. We don't have rules. We don't have regulations. What do we do about permits? What do we do about pricing, saturation? How do we control that? What about safety? Whole range of issues. We are therefore, Annie Dasgupta's at the back, who is a global director in charge of the WRI Ross Center. That's a cities thing. We're launching something next week at the World Bank WRI Transforming Transportation. It's a big conference next week, which is a really wonderful annual thing. We're launching this with many partners, about 50 partners, and there will be more joining. Basically, with the goal of saying to all of these cities that want to struggle with these issues, we'll help you and we'll try and create, not WRI, but this group of companies, cities, and so on, will try and advance this agenda so that there will, over the next 5 years, start to become real policies that actually embrace this technology. And at the end of the day, this is potentially an extremely important shift, not in the shape of cities necessary, but how we use the streets in cities. For the last 100 years, we have been designing streets and roads for automobiles and not for people. And what this is saying is actually, it sort of be more efficient, more fun, safer, environmentally sustainable, huge benefits to climate change if we actually created city streets that humans use. And so this is a major thrust at the moment. And if you want to ask more, Annie's here to answer them. So story 6, will it be a fad or will it be the future? And story 7, as you can probably imagine, I mean, we're here in Washington, D.C., we have to have a story on where next. Now, of course, it changes every day. Where next on U.S. climate action? Are we starting maybe to see the turning of the tide in light of the recent elections and in light of the amazing leadership at the subnational and corporate level? I mean, first, the bad news, they're working very hard and quite efficiently. I mean, it's one of the few parts of this administration that actually is fairly efficient, the way they are trying to tear down regulations. But of course, some people in this room are more efficient in trying to block them. So thank you for your service. So at least 70 plus currently are in the works. You know where they are, so I won't go into them all. So here's a question. Do you think that with all of the impressive work at the states and cities and corporates, we could get there? This is work that we do as part of America's pledge. So you remember Mr. Obama said that by 2025, we would lower U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28%. This is sort of our estimate under current measures. with a big lift, we think we could get down to that. With an impossibly big lift, you could get down to here, by the way, even without federal regulations. But we would make the point that the federal government does need to engage. There are some who say we don't need the federal government. We do need the federal government. So that's the context, if you like. And now we're starting to see something we actually haven't seen for some decades, a sort of genuine public sort of outrage and mobilization, the Sunrise Movement and so on. And you've all seen the Green New Deal sparking a great deal of debate. You don't need to agree with every single thing they say. I'm sure you don't. But there is a level of energy which surely is very healthy. 10 new governors have now taken office, committed to real energy progress and renewables and energy efficiency. This is the 29 states today which have renewable energy standards, or some kind of targets. And it's very mixed, by the way, in terms of what they are, what the timeline is. There's these 6 states that actually have between 50% and 100% targets. You know, some with 100% renewable targets, Hawaii and California, for example. So those are the 6 that are going a little bit further. Now, there's another, so look at that. That's another 12 that have new governments or governors in their states that have committed to act. And some of them are pretty interesting states, if you look at it. They've committed to have some kind of energy, real, genuine energy targets at the 50% to 100% level. And then there's a group of states that are in the so-called US Climate Alliance that have committed to the Paris deal and say they are going to make sure that they do their part of it. So this, if you like, is the sort of the territory we're in right now. Now, in some states where there are no targets, individual utilities are starting to act. I mean, Xcel has announced, and it operates, you know, the Midwest and the western part of the country, are carbon-free by 2030. And so, too, you're seeing some others where the utilities themselves are starting to take this seriously. And that's something to watch. We and many other organizations are very involved in this transition with regard to utilities and so on, the introduction of green tariffs and that kind of thing. And the big corporate purchasers play a very important role here too. The reason that some states you wouldn't expect to have introduced renewable energy and green tariffs is because major companies have said, we'll put $1 billion worth of servers here if you genuinely create new electrons from renewable, and we can have a green tariff for that. So that's encouraging. Will more states adopt carbon pricing? Well, we know some will already. New Jersey is joining RGGI. Virginia is capping the power and having links to RGGI. Oregon has announced it will adopt economy-wide carbon pricing. There are several others that have indicated they want to move in that direction. So watch this space. Here's a very interesting thing. So far, the carbon trading in this country and the taxes has basically been an energy story. But there's now a lot of talk about bringing transportation. Now, this is very important for the electrification of vehicles, of course. And so transport, as you know, is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And so these 9 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states are actively designing, and we expect this year will actually bring some new policies to include transportation. So that's quite exciting as well. Will EVs, electric vehicles, continue their meteoric rise? Now, this is great, 361,000 in 2018. Important to remember that we purchase 17 million vehicles in this country. So it's still 361 out of 17 million. So we've got a long way to go. Number 1 selling vehicle in America by the total revenue, by the way, adding all the cars and multiplying by the price this last year was Tesla Model 3, which is interesting. So we're seeing that. Will we see this continue? Now, it turns out that Tesla and General Motors have now gone over the 200,000 mark, so they're no longer eligible for various tax incentives, unfortunately. That will hurt them. But at the same time, to the extent you have some of this transportation, that will actually add some more zip to it. And finally, what will Congress do? Well, second to finally, what will Congress do? We're not expecting any great legislation to be signed by Mr. Trump in 2019, but we are very much expecting some pretty interesting debates going on. Already, a carbon dividend bill has been submitted by Republicans and Democrats before Christmas. We'll see a lot more of that. Senator Schumer has said that he wants to give high priority to the infrastructure bill and insists that we'll have strong sustainability elements. This is the most likely actually to pass in 2019. Last year we had 45Q, which was a tax break for carbon capture and storage. There are various other things that might be in the works here. Watch this. So these are three things to watch. And the question is not whether these, we're going to see some great new law, but whether or not by the end of this year, we're starting to see a conversation and a shift in the tone, which we expect because, as I think everybody has seen, the new data that suggests that the majority of Americans actually do want to act on climate change. And part of this is precisely this, what Nancy Pelosi said, is that we need to listen to where the people are. And the people are clearly way, way, way ahead of where the Congress is today. Now, what about the 2020? Well, I think everybody is aware how confusing things are there. But the question will be, unlike last presidential election, when climate change was basically nowhere, will we see it being pretty central this time? And we believe that's very lucky indeed. So that's story number 7, for which you'll be truly thankful. Turning the tide, are we ready for something different in 2019? And just, so these are the 7 stories. Will geopolitics stymie climate action? Will climate adaptation rise? Will fast fashion slow down? Will commodity supply chains rise to the challenge? Will the Belt and Road advance? Green growth? Is micromobility a fad or the future? And what about turning the tide? Now, just a bonus before we end. We tend to focus on 1 year, obviously. But it's important to take a longer view. 100 years from now, when they look back on 2019, what will they say? And for that, it's worth looking back 100 years for us. And so 100 years ago, this year, 1919, we had the Treaty of Versailles, pretty important, changed the world for the next 100 years. We had Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations. Sadly, it went nowhere, so they had the same problem of multilateralism that we have today. Mahatma Gandhi began his nonviolent resistance. We have the Sunrise Movement, which I don't think is quite as significant, or the Yellow Vests in Paris, I'm afraid, but how transformative. Think about how each of these events 100 years ago have transformed the next century. Grand Canyon was designated a national park. The first transatlantic flight 100 years ago. And most important of all, the first pop-up toaster. And obviously, if we don't see the progress we want, we will all be toast. So thank you very much. Let's now discuss it. Thank you. So people raise questions, please do. But also on your seat, there are cards. If you prefer just to write them in, we'll send them. Great. Please. How nice.
I tried to write it down, but I couldn't get the wording correctly. Thank you. Hi, I'm Mary Gregory from Brown Advisory in Baltimore. And one thing I've been reading a little bit about is blockchain as an enabling technology for increasing efficiency in industry. And I thought of it a couple of times during your presentation when you were talking about commodities and when you were talking about the fashion industry and the life cycle, et cetera. Is that something that you all have looked at in your research? And do you have any views on how blockchain might play into sustainability in any way?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Shall we get, Michael, why don't we get sort of 3 or 4, and then I actually will farm out the answers, at least some of them. Yes, please, that's it.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV. Very nicely done. Thank you for hosting this. Looking at the Belt and Road, being right in the middle of your topics, how do you see that? Because so many countries are going to be impacted by this. So many countries are going to be involved, and also you have multinational bodies that are now collaborating in this through investments and oversight. How do you see that impacting for, say, even the next decade as far as where we're going as far as environmental quality and economic development?
Thank you very much. Why don't we take one more and then, yes.
Yes, John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. Worldwide road deaths are up to 1.3 million now, tremendous human and economic toll. How does that fit in with any of your 7 stories?
Great. So why don't we take those 3 and let's try and be brief. I'll answer the ones that. So let's start on the last one. Road safety and micro mobility, obviously very related. Who's going to deal with that? Michael?
Ani is pointing to somebody, but is it Sergio? Sergio, do you want to take this or Ani? Sergio.
So road safety and the micro.
Yes. We are very concerned about road safety. We work in different countries to improve road safety. We are working with cities to reduce fatalities. And these solutions could improve road safety if cities consider to redesign streets to receive these new solutions. It's essential in our vision to protect pedestrians. This is the king of the streets in our vision. And this kind of solution are increasing the debates in the city. São Paulo is one good example. To improve the quality of the streets, to design to protect pedestrians.
Good. So on the sort of overall impact, I mean, obviously, Belt and Road has a geopolitical as well as a developmental role, and it's fascinating to watch how different institutions are joining or not joining, different countries are joining or not joining, and I think the stakes are incredibly high. This could be a great blessing if both the Chinese government plus those other governments and multilateral agencies that are part of this actually say, look, we're going to do this right. You know, we have 60 years of experience of how to do good investments and bad investments in developing countries, and we're going to do it right. But that will require actually just a little more surprising, a little bit more top-down, a little more central coordination, which is odd when we talk about China, but in fact is very decentralized, actually. And so we're hoping and praying for that and working very, very hard on this, by the way. So could be highly positive or could lead to a lot of indebtedness, quite frankly, because this is not grant money for the most part. This is loan money. On blockchain, this is a terrific question. There's a huge amount of work, as you know, on blockchain. Every year at Davos, 2 weeks from now, well, I'll be in sessions there where, you know, there is slightly too much hype about, that's not Davos's fault, by the way, it's the advocates of blockchain as to what it could do. I mean, in the case of environment, I mean, there's a whole load of discussion about trading carbon using blockchain, whole lot of discussion on supply chains and blockchain. Quite frankly, it's at the stage of great ideas and a lot more work. We have a small program of work in our forest program and so on, and we'd be happy to discuss it with you more. Anyone else? Yes?
So we have a question on utility level storage. So a question on energy storage. I can't quite read it, but it's a few different companies working together and the future prospects for utility level storage. So I'm going to ask Jennifer Lakey, the head of our energy program, to respond.
We've seen a dramatic decrease in the price in battery storage, and there are other technologies, compressed air storage, obviously hydro storage, which has been used for many years. So we do see a significant increase in the number of policies and regulatory proceedings that are being initiated in order to create the market advantage for doing renewables plus storage. Just to think about, there are about 150 different policies that we're tracking in the renewable space that link storage and renewables. That's how some of these utility targets are actually going to take shape, by thinking through and looking at system-wide solutions rather than trying to create an incentive for a single type of a technology like a wind or a solar target. By thinking about carbon-free gives you the ability to play in different markets, capacity markets, real-time and variable power services to the grid, and thinking through then how you allow for more linked, distributed, and centralized options.
And do you have another one?
I do. Christina Chan is going to respond to this question regarding the World Bank. And maybe Andrew wants to follow up as well, since he has some experience at the World Bank. But it says World Bank directed half their climate funds to adaptation. Why not center all investments to adaptation and resilience? So I don't know. Christina might think that's a good idea.
Christina is our Director for Adaptation and Resilience here, and also a co-director of the Global Adaptation Commission.
Hi, I think it's great that the World Bank made a commitment to $50 billion for adaptation. I think others should follow their lead. I do think that the investments that the World Bank makes also has implications for getting us to that 1.5 or 2 degree world. And so the idea of centering all of its commitments to adaptation probably is not as useful, but really great that they are increasing their commitment to adaptation finance.
Thank you. Yes, over here and here. It's behind you.
Oh. Me first? Yeah, I'm Ethan Goffman from EarthTalk. I was in the sustainable apparel story. I was interested that there's now 50, I'm old and out of it, so I was a little shocked by the 50 micro seasons. So I do want to ask, yeah, we can have decoupling and we can have, full cycle where you reuse and everything, but there seems to be kind of a capitalist growth push for more and more cheap products that we then throw out. Like stuff is badly made from China. We buy new ones every few years. It's cheaper to buy new than to repair. I think there might be a problem with our economic model that it just pushing endless growth of products is not sustainable. I don't think we have an alternative model that works.
Great. That's a good question.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll move on.
Very much. We'll turn to you in a minute. One more question over here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Sheldon Cohen with the Nature Conservancy. Question on biodiversity. You mentioned that China will be hosting the Biodiversity Convention COP meeting in 2020. That's a very important meeting to set the agenda for the next 10 years, et cetera. What are some of the ideas that WRI or its partners are discussing with the Chinese government in terms of potential announcements by President Xi at the Biodiversity COP meeting that year?
Great. Thank you very much. Let's take one more if there is one. Yes, here.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm Smita Thomas with Energy Shrink. I was wondering, when you talk about commitments from different companies towards your green goals, is WRI working on any measurable metrics when people tick check boxes and say that they're doing, making green commitments? Are there any measurable metrics being worked on by these different companies like Nestle you mentioned?
Okay, thank you very much. So, Liz, well, no, first on I want to do sustainable apparel and then move on to that. So, okay.
I'm not going to answer the question of do we need a new economic model, but I am going to recognize the challenge that you described. And in fact, if you walk over to H&M in Union Station, you'll see there's a great sign on the wall that says rewear, reuse, recycle. It's enormous. And right next to it is a sign that says we have new stuff coming in every day. So why don't you? And I think that's at the crux of the dilemma you're bringing out. I do want to just wrap this in with the blockchain question, which I think was related partly to fashion slowdown. And Andrew's helping me out because the answer is no, we didn't look at blockchain. I think blockchain, like internet, is a technology that can help, but it also has the capacity to help people buy more stuff more often than they do now. Just like the internet can help us replace bricks and mortar with virtual buying, but it can also help us get what we want the moment we want it. So really what we're trying to look at is how can businesses come up with models that help them grow, because we do want to bring people out of poverty around the world. We want to carry on that good news, but models that help people, businesses grow and help employment, but that also allow us to do it disconnected from using new virgin resources from the ground. So that's the sort of approach we're trying to take.
Great, thank you. And then Jennifer on the measurement.
The question of how how we're tracking corporate action on the energy side, on renewable energy commitments in particular, we formed an alliance called the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. And through that alliance and through the partnership that we have with over 65 companies through that alliance, we are tracking power purchase deals that are done by these companies. Now, there are several who have matched their existing power demand with renewables purchases at 100% of their match. Now, that doesn't equate to system change, and that's the key piece of this that we're going to be looking for going forward. Not just can you match the amount of energy that you're consuming with a renewables resource, but what impact does that have on the system? And are we decarbonizing the system as we need to? And that's why some of these utility actions alongside buyer commitments are critical. And at rebuyers.org, you can look at a pie chart of all of the purchases that have been made year on year by these corporations.
Great, thank you very much indeed. On the issue of the economic model and too much stuff, I mean, we're finding, Kevin basically said, you know, we are starting to work on that. Very good paper read that Kevin's team wrote called The Elephant in the Boardroom a few months ago. Basically, the elephant being, is there going to come a time when we actually face up to the fact that we just can't go on selling more and more and more? And surprisingly, some companies are saying, yeah, maybe we've peaked in terms of what we sell. So the big debate then is, how do we as a company, given that we don't want to sell more candy to children, you know, more stuff to people who don't need it, how do we then get higher quality, higher revenue, so we move from quantity to quality? So I think there's a big issue over the next 10 years on this subject. On the, I'm embarrassed to answer to the Nature Conservancy on what is going on, because you guys are doing amazing work and we're working with TNC. Look, I think it's early days. There are already ideas being put on the table for 2020, and there's obviously sort of a New Deal for Nature is sort of one of the organizing principles. Nature Needs Half is another one. 30 by 30 is, National Geographic. I think yourselves are involved in that. And again, I mean, it's something that's, you work on this as well, but it's actually very nice to see now the corporate sector engaging with governments, with research centers. Again, in Davos in 2 weeks, this is a big theme. It's going to be in each of the upcoming meetings. And obviously, it's not for NGOs to be seen to be thrusting their ideas on the agenda. This has to be sort of bottom up. But as part of the China Council, the government's asked for strong engagement from us all. And this, at the end of the day, is very difficult. I mean, we all rejoiced with these Aichi targets, and few of them have been made. But I mean, quite frankly, we've dropped the ball. So the question is, what do we do next that will give us more confidence that we're actually going to seize this once and for all? If I had time, I'd ask you to answer your own question, actually. Good. Any more questions? Yes, here.
Hi, Joel Jager, Johns Hopkins Sci student and former WRI. My question's about climate adaptation. And so there's a lot of interesting things going on sort of outside the UNFCCC process that you talked about, but I was wondering about whether we can expect to see adaptation to get actually higher profile in the COPs, and what was its profile at Katowice?
Good. What was the profile at Katowice, and are we going to see the same as we have on mitigation, where corporates have actually persuaded the delegates to engage more? Reed.
Hi, Reed Dutchin with the United Nations Foundation. In the Belt and Road discussion, Andrew, you had that alarming slide about the level of investment in fossil fuel generation. That's been driven as much by Chinese suppliers' subsidies as it has by recipient demand. In that area, as well as in the geopolitics and climate area, do you think that China, which has invested so heavily in its renewable energy industry and is coming up against the limits of its own domestic demand for that, will see that its greater economic self-interest will be in promoting its renewable energy exports as opposed to its fossil energy exports?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. Christina, on the adaptation story, what happened at Katowice? And are we expecting it to rise on the UNFCCC agenda?
Thank you. I think it's a great question. Given that adaptation was a core component of the Paris Agreement, and as the parties to the UNFCCC are working out how to implement the Paris Agreement, including through the rule book that was agreed to in Katowice, I would say that adaptation is and should be a part of a priority for the UNFCCC, given its prominence in the Paris Agreement. That said, the issues being worked out within the rule book and on adaptation, it's different. It's not apples to apples with mitigation. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you very much. Reed, it's a terrific point you're making. I would agree with what you seem to be implying, which is the direction of travel, I think, is pretty unambiguous. I mean, it makes no sense for China or anybody to, over the long term, massively flood the market and be seen to be supporting coal-based or even gas, quite frankly, based electricity generation. But there's a lot of coal in this as well, by the way. The logic, the arithmetic, and the politics, and obviously the environment are all on the side of renewable energy. And one of the encouraging things, as you sort of implied, is that the big renewable players in China are now getting big enough to actually have some role in influencing those flows of funds. And one of the really fascinating things, which I didn't show here, is that the vast majority of Belt and Road money is public money, albeit it's loans, sometimes equity, occasionally a small amount of grant, Silk Road Fund, for example, but mainly loans. But then there's a relatively small amount of private Chinese investment. And the Chinese private investment is massively renewable. It's much more than 50%, which is an interesting point to sort of support your point. So I think one of the things that's sort of pretty obvious is that this kind of data that I showed today is something that, number one, China actually is interested in seeing, and number two, it sort of has an interest in changing that data. The problem is the Chinese government, because they don't quite yet have the institutional setup for Belt and Road, isn't publishing this data themselves. So our team, Leo's not here, but our team spent a huge amount of work looking at the recipient country data, matching it with the data from each of these individual financial institutions. I mean, it's hard work, but not impossible work, and came out with these data, which everybody, seems to believe as accurate. So over time, and this is an important year in this regard, will there be sort of official data that comes out, which will surely drive things in a somewhat better. So I'm not concerned about the direction of change. We should be concerned about the pace of change, because every single power plant that's locked in with coal is locked in for the next 50 years. So this is dangerous. And given that it's financed by debt, the entire financial model is that those power plants need to generate enough revenue to pay off their debt, which means they have to stay in life for the next 40, 50 years, which is too long. Final question. We're just coming up to the finish line now. But there's coffee and donuts and whatever else you want, so you don't need to go home. One question here.
Hi, yeah, Shayla with the Climate Leadership Council. My question is regarding carbon pricing. So you mentioned the bill that was put out at the federal level. Do you see carbon pricing being talked about at the more international level to incentivize sustainable growth and development?
Yeah. By the way, you guys are doing a fantastic job. Thank you very much for the work you're doing and the coalition you've put together. Yes, I think that we now have, partly through, and maybe I'm going to turn to Helen actually, because she's on the executive committee of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Committee, and she's our vice president in charge of economics and climate, so is perfectly equipped to answer the question. Oh.
Thanks very much. Yes, in fact, we're actually seeing it developing quite rapidly around the world. We have now in place something like 70 carbon pricing schemes around the world in different countries, states, or provinces, or either in place today or about to be put in place. There are plans actively going forward. This is a huge increase. It covers about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions compared to in 2004, 1% of greenhouse gas emissions under carbon pricing. So there has been a big spread. A lot of the push where it has happened has been because of the development or social or other objectives which these carbon pricing schemes can achieve, particularly how the revenues can be used is one of the big interests. And we've seen in a number of places, British Columbia, but also other places around the world, where they've been reinvested to ensure that low-income households actually benefit more or as much from the carbon tax as they would have without it. So that's definitely one of the objectives moving forward. At the same time, as Andrew emphasized, there's also a lot of controversy around carbon pricing as well, and quite a lot of debates. So definitely progress, but not always easy.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. I wonder, Annie, whether you would just say a word about the launch of Numo next week, because it fits so beautifully into this story.
Very happy to. Thank you very much. I think the main point, and someone asked the question, is as you can see from Andrew's presentation, a lot of innovation is going on. We see a lot of products out there driven by private sector. We think a lot of these innovation can be very good for cities. If cities have the policies in place to see how this innovation, the speed of innovation is much faster, and even the biggest cities in the world are able to manage. You must have seen in the newspaper how London and New York both banned Uber and then came back, because they're all struggling to figure out how does the new system work with the existing system, how we basically reduce car uses and increase public transportation and micromobility. That's the goal, how to make it safer. So the initiative we put in together is to create an alliance with the manufacturers, suppliers of these services, and the cities together to figure out what kind of policies do we need, what kind of systems do we need in place that encourages innovation and also makes this thing work for people and for planet at the same time. We need to make it more efficient, also make it more climate friendly, to create a place that we can learn across the world and actually share information faster and faster with cities. That's the goal of it. But the cool thing, I hope, is actually bring this coalition between Ubers of the world and Limes of the world and Fords of the world, but also the cities of the world, so that this vacuum there is in policy can be actually done together. That's cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie, very much. So we've reached the end now. Michael, your final word from you, but also thank you, because Michael's comms team sort of put this together. I'd like to ask those people at the beginning, could you stand up, please, and give these guys a round of applause, because they did all the work. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. And let me just say, we deeply value the partnership that we have with those of you in this room. Our motto at WRI is count it, change it, scale it. We're good at counting, and some of you are too. We're very good at data and analysis and research. We're sort of quite good at changing in a few areas, some cities, some corporations, and a few countries. Scaling it, we can't do on our own, and probably you can't either. we need to work together, and we deeply value the friendship and the soulmateness and the partnership we have with many of you in this room. So we look forward to 2019 as deepening those partnerships. So thank you very much. Michael.
Thank you, Andrew. How can Andrew's very modest, but giving this presentation covering 7 stories, the globe, answering questions on the fly, and somehow getting all those data points right over 100 slides. Thank you, Andrew. Enjoy, have some coffee, send us your feedback, and keep talking about these stories over the year. Thank you for your support. Thank you.